Hello there, my name is Jeff, Dharma name Xiǎnzé. I am doing today's Dharma talk, and I'd like to talk about, there is a sutta that goes over the topic of proliferation fairly well, that's really well known, that I'm actually not going to talk about today, the Honeyball Sutta. There's another one that I found that talks about proliferation a little bit. And I'll explain what that is if you're not familiar, talk about the sutta as we go. But I like this one because it talks about one of the Buddha's disciples, Venerable Anuruddha. So I have a little bit of a fascination with the disciples. They kind of come alive if you really look into the history of Buddhism. The suttas preserve some of their personality and their behaviors, some of their practices that vary from one person to another. And Anuruddha is one that I hadn't really explored very much, but I have a book, an audio book actually, that I've listened to that it's called Great Disciples of the Buddha. And it talks a lot about each disciple. It goes through each one, references where in the Pali Suttas that this information came from about their personality and their history and that type of thing. So I'll tell you a little bit of background about Anuruddha, and then we'll go over the Anuruddha Sutta. So that's the Bhikkhu Bodhi version that I have in this book, Bhikkhu Bodhi translation, I should say. And then I also have one from Thanissaro Bhikkhu that's interesting to compare the two. But first, some of the stories from the great disciples of the Buddha about Anuruddha are kind of interesting. He was the Buddha's cousin. It sounds like since the Buddha was one of the princes, he was also royalty, and it sounds like he was a little bit, not really spoiled, but not in a rotten kind of way, but given a very easy and full sort of childhood, to where he didn't, there's a story about him never wanting for anything and didn't know the meaning of there isn't any. So once he was playing marbles with other children, and he was betting cakes. So he was betting these sweet cakes. And whenever they ran out of cakes, because I guess he wasn't doing very well, his mother said that there isn't any more cakes. Said there isn't any cakes. And he had never heard that phrase before, that there isn't any. Just hadn't been a thing for him. He always had what he wanted. So he was asking for there isn't any cakes. And so there's a whole story about how then the Devas, because of his good karma, filled up the plate of empty cakes because his mom was going to send him an empty tray as a lesson. But then he got these divine cakes and they were beautiful. But it kind of relays how privileged this person was. So whenever Anuruddha was a little bit older and the Buddha had already gone forth, the Buddha had inspired many of his own relatives to go forth themselves to pursue the spiritual life. But none in Anuruddha's direct family had gone forth. So Anuruddha's brother went to him and he said, either you go forth or I should go forth, because they figured somebody in their family should. And Anuruddha said, but I have been delicately nurtured. I'm not able to go forth into homelessness. You go forth. So he says, no, you. Anuruddha's brother then went into a long explanation about what would have to be done as far as reaping the crops and sowing the crops and digging up weeds, harvesting them, winnowing the straw, winnowing the chaff, sift the chaff, and do the same thing year after year. And basically that's your life. So he told that to Anuruddha. And Anuruddha asked, when will the work stop? When will we be able to amuse ourselves unconcerned, supplied and furnished with the 5 cords of sensual pleasure? And his brother replied sharply, "There is no stop to the work, my dear Aniruddha. No end to the work is ever to be discerned. Even when our fathers and grandfathers passed away, the work was not to be stopped." And it's kind of funny. The commentary that this was drawn from says that before his brother had even finished, Aniruddha had decided that he was going to go forth into homelessness. So the long sort of description of all the work he would have to do, I think in a way, they say that he at that time was starting to see through and say, oh, well, this is just a cycle that you'll have to go through forever, and maybe I should get out of this. But to a spoiled young man, it also sort of sounds like there might have been a part of him that thought maybe he doesn't have to do all of this reaping and sowing and stuff like that if he was able to become an ascetic. And of course, that's not an easier life, but I think that that might have been a component. So anyway, he went to his mother and he said he wanted to go forth into homelessness and become an ascetic. Initially, she refused. And she said that if his friend, the chieftain, Vadia, would also go forth, that Aniruddha could. And I think that at least it's speculated that she thought maybe he wouldn't go, that Vadia wouldn't go forth. So initially he did refuse. He was a chieftain and he had all of these responsibility and things that he had to deal with. But eventually Aniruddha got him to agree to go forth in 7 years. And Aniruddha said, that's too long. We can't wait 7 years. We have to go forth sooner. And so then eventually Aniruddha starts to wear him down a little bit to where I think he said 7 months, and then it was 7 weeks, and eventually 7 days. So they both get to where in 7 days they're going to go forth. And they actually convinced several other people, which are relatively famous in the suttas. Ananda and Devadatta went forth with them. So several members of the Buddhist family joined as well. So it's just interesting to see the background of all of this. It reveals a little bit about his character and his upbringing. Rather than just jumping into the sutta, I feel like it's helpful to do. But I'll go on to the sutta itself. And I won't read the whole thing word for word, because you can go and do that on Access to Insight or several places. But once we have the context of it, we can see that Aniruddha is a monk at this time. He is training. He's alone in seclusion, so he's likely had some amount of training before this with the Buddha and with the Buddha's disciples. Definitely there's some record of him training with Sariputta before this. But at this time, this is the last teaching that's recorded given to Aniruddha before he has a lot of breakthrough and becomes an arhat, according to the Pali Suttas. So this is the Buddha's teaching to him. So the first part, once the Blessed One was staying among the Bhagas in the deer park at Vesakala Grove near the Crocodile Hunt, and Venerable Aniruddha was living among the Setis in the Eastern Bamboo Park. So Aniruddha was alone in seclusion, and he thought this line of thinking: the Dhamma is for one who is modest, one who is not for one who is self-aggrandizing. The Dhamma is for one who is content, not for one who is discontent. The Dhamma is for one who is reclusive, not for one who is entangled. This Dhamma is for one whose persistence is aroused, not for one who is lazy. This Dhamma is for one whose mindfulness is established, not for one whose mindfulness is confused. It's for one whose mind is centered, not for one whose mind is uncentered. And it's for one endowed with discernment, not for one whose discernment is weak. So that's 7 things that Aniruddha was thinking. There's a story that says that Sariputta told him to contemplate on the 8 qualities of a great person, but I wasn't actually able to find that anywhere. Could just be in the commentary. But either way, So the Blessed One, realizing with his awareness the line of Venerable Anuruddha's thinking, just as a strong man might extend his flexed arm or flex his extended arm, he disappeared from the deer park and he appeared with Anuruddha. And he said, good, very good. It's good that you have thought these thoughts of a great person. And then he goes through that list again. But at the end, then he says, now then, Anuruddha, think the eighth thought of a great person. This Dhamma is for one who enjoys non-objectification, who delights in non-objectification, not for one who enjoys and delights in objectification. So this is one place that Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, he says proliferation. Thanusaro Bhikkhu says objectification and non-objectification. So I'll bring that up a little bit later. So then the Buddha goes on to teach a little bit about when you think these thoughts, these 8 thoughts of a great person, then whenever you want, quite withdrawn from sensuality, withdrawn from unskillful qualities, you will enter and remain in the first jhana. And he goes on to talk about the jhanas. It's kind of the standard script about those in the texts if you've seen it before. But the point is that these thoughts, dwelling in these things, is something that just putting aside all the concentration stages and that complicated stuff, these things will help you with your meditation. So that's what the Buddha was saying. He was saying that when you think these things, that this is what you think, and you dwell on these qualities, these thoughts, these 8 thoughts of a great person, then whenever you want, you can go into a deeper state of meditation. So there's also a part in here where he talks about not just the concentration stages, but talking about how this would help in more practical sort of thoughts. So he says, when you think these thoughts of a great person and become a person who can attain at will, the 4 jhanas, he says, then your robe of cast off rags will seem to you to just be like the clothes chest of a householder or householder's son, full of clothes of many colors. Talks about how if you have medicine that's made from animal urine, it'll seem like this wonderful medicine. If you have, something that is unpleasant that you have to deal with in life, it can become something that's less unpleasant or something that is not agitating. And he even says at the end, as you live contented, it will serve for your delight, for a comfortable abiding, for non-agitation, and for alighting on unabiding. So after this, the Buddha tells him to stay there among the settis of the rain for the rains retreat. And Anuruddha stays there and dwells on those 8 thoughts and attains enlightenment. So he was able to use this teaching to see quite deeply into the practice and understand the Buddha's teaching quite well. Some of these factors, some of these 8 thoughts of a great person echo or have components of the 7 factors of enlightenment. So that's probably part of what helped there. The 7 factors being mindfulness, investigation. There was investigation in there. There was mindfulness, energy, rapture, calm, concentration, and equanimity. So if you listen to the 8 thoughts of a great person, I'll read them one more time. It really echoes a lot of those, but it's in a more practical sense in a way. I feel like anyway with the 7 factors, sometimes it's easy to just see them as maybe more of an academic sort of thing. But this is, thinking what the Buddha is saying, this is part of how you can execute these. So to look at him again, it's the Dhamma is for one whose mindfulness is established, not for one whose mindfulness is confused. For one whose mind is centered, not uncentered. For one who is endowed with discernment, not whose discernment is weak. So you can see that if I go on and read the whole list, which I'm trying to avoid filling your head with lists, then it echoes those 7 factors of enlightenment. So going on, I don't plan, like I said, to talk much about the Honeyball Sutta because I don't want to get into the specifics of how proliferation arises and how it passes away, because I think that that's also academic and perhaps not very helpful for people that are newer in the practice. It can be helpful if you delve into it, if you've got some experience, but in a basic sense, the Honeyball Sutta does at least outline how proliferation happens. So you've got contact with the senses. So your senses are generating something that makes feeling, perception arises, and perception brings views. And then we start thinking about those things, at least the initial thought, and then proliferation happens. And proliferation is basically building a story on something. So for example, if I had never seen this before, I wouldn't really know what it was. But I have seen this object with my eye. And in a split second, I've had proliferation that showed me that this was an ink pen based on my experience, because all of those things arose within just a split moment. And that's proliferation. Is it helpful to think about proliferation? I think it is, if you're thinking about it in the right way. For the general practitioner, it doesn't seem that looking at trying to peel back the experience, especially even in daily life, not just in meditation, but when you're going through your daily life, it would be difficult to experience any kind of non-proliferation for most people, especially lay people. But proliferation comes in different degrees. I think that, when I talk about the ink pen, that's the split-second lightning flash of proliferation that you get when you see an object, and the understanding of what that is arises based on your history and your experience. But proliferation is also the story that we're telling ourselves when we sit on the cushion, whenever we are carried away from our object of meditation by hindrances, by things that are stealing our attention and keeping us from being better at meditation. All of that is proliferation. And not all proliferation is necessarily bad, because it takes some amount of thinking and doing with the world to interact with it, to stay alive, to feed the homeless, to do all of those things. But this is why the Buddha talked about ethical and unethical, or skillful and unskillful qualities and thoughts. Anyway, so proliferation comes in different degrees. And I think that the theme of our talks being harmony, communal harmony, harmony between others, I think that this does fit well into the theme, because all of these sort of anger, fear, restlessness, all of the things that we experience that cause interpersonal difficulty come from proliferation. And we can see when this is happening, maybe not in the lightning flash of understanding what a pen is and what it does based on our experience, but when you start to get carried away by emotion and thought of something being real that isn't happening right now, then you can kind of remember and reorient that the Buddha was just saying that these thoughts of a great person, the 8th thought is delighting in non-proliferation. It is delighting in non-objectification. And so if we're sitting there getting carried away into a story, I think it is helpful to look at that situation and say, oh, this is all just something that I'm building based on experience and sensory data, and this mind is feeding these sort of things into me. You can sort of snap out of that and go back to equanimity, go back to having a little bit of distance from your thoughts. And that's the role, I think, of the practice, where if you practice frequently, it is much easier. Frequently meaning, if you practice every day, for example, it's much easier than when you do notice that you're being caught up in the story to go back to your breath, to go back to your whatever it is. even for just a moment while you were driving, someone cuts you off and you're angry. What you can do during that time is you can indulge in that and let it go and let it proliferate into a story. But by the time you've become angry and notice there's some level of proliferation that's happened, and you can look at that as an uninvolved person. You don't have to be drawn into the story and let it continue. Let your heart rate continue to race and let your anger continue and let it affect your behavior. You can have some distance from that. So I do think that there's a lot of value in this. The sutta I was debating about whether to even use this, because this is the last teaching that the Buddha gave to an arhat before his enlightenment. That's kind of a big deal. But just like many of the Buddhist teachings, this scales up to a wider scale to where people will be able to use it in their daily life for maybe the less practiced people. Or it scales all the way down, kind of like dependent origination or some of those other teachings, that it scales all the way down to a very minute level, where if you continue to look at this type of teaching and analyze how your experience of reality is coming into being, passing away, eventually you get more and more, not really control over your experience, but more and more control over your future. I think that's the thing I'd like to talk about most. I've spent a lot of time going over this stuff, but we can't really change our thoughts right now. So let's say we do get caught off in traffic or something happens and we're already angry, we've already proliferated. The time to change that, to get some distance from it, is right now. But what you're doing is you're not making that thought go away. You're not trying to make something disappear, because that's your reality at the moment. You shouldn't try to escape from it or push it away or do something with it. The idea then, though, is to recognize that you have a choice in how your future progresses. So your future is unfolding within every moment. And if you were to continue to dwell in that anger, that frustration, when someone cuts you off or whenever that happens, that you get drawn into a story, well, if you choose to dwell in that, your future lies within that. Your future will be the same. Much of what you can expect will happen. You'll have those effects of your anger. You might have some effect where negative consequences result. Or you can choose in that moment to change your future. So how do you do that? You have to look at what you're experiencing and not push it away, not grasp towards something else, but just accept it as it is and move your mind back to a wholesome object. So that could be the breath, it could be something else. But if you're not pushing something away, if you're not trying to squish your mind into a mold that doesn't exist, then I think it would be much easier then to control your future and have what you would like arise, which is equanimity, calm, mindfulness, all of those factors of enlightenment that will lead to your happiness. So I've had some experience with this recently. So I had a cat that for 19 years, she just died on July 12th. For 19 years, I had her, which predates my wife. It predates, to some extent, my practice. So I got her at a time when I was just a regular person, not even a lay person. And for years, I spent all of this time fostering my interaction with her, my love with her. Her name was Sasha. And she died just recently, and it is painful. 19 years is a long time to be with a friend, and then they die. But when this pain arises, I have to recognize a few things. The first thing is that it's arising because I put my attention on things that I put my craving and desire in things that were impermanent, insubstantial, and ultimately, it's not that she didn't lead to my happiness in that time, but she didn't lead to permanent, lasting happiness. That's what the Buddha partially means by dukkha. So I don't regret, obviously, having her or being with her any more than I would regret my wife or anybody like that. And I'm not saying that you should avoid attachments of these kinds, but you do have to be careful on how you're engaging with them. But the main point of this is that I spent all that time fostering craving and attachment for her. So when she died, I experienced a lot of pain. Of course I did. This is the natural result of what I did. I spent all that time unwisely choosing my attention. But what do I do about it now? You know, what do you do about pain when it's already arisen, when it's already so strong that you don't know how to proceed? Grief, things like that. These are the effects of attachment. But I think the thing to do is not to push it away any more than Anaruto, when he was dying. He apparently experienced a great deal of pain, but it's interesting to see that even the arhats, even the other monks that were around him at the time, according to the information I read about him, was saying that he dealt with the pain very well. The pain didn't destroy him, didn't make him unmindful. He maintained his peace despite all of that. So that's what he was able to do, and what I can do, and what anyone else can do in a time of difficulty, whenever your craving has experienced its results and you're having difficulty, grief or pain or anger or whatever it is. Don't push it away or run away from it. You have to experience that in that moment, but you can choose in your future what you will experience by placing your attention wisely. So by that, I mean that if you dwell in that grief and anger or pain or whatever, if you dwell in that hindrance that's arisen, then it'll become stronger. That's how it works. That's how that craving arose, that when Sasha died, I experienced a lot of pain and loss. That craving arose in that way. If I dwell on it, it won't get weaker. It doesn't just pass on its own. If you take your mind and move it to a wholesome or skillful object of attention whenever that arises, sometimes that might be extremely difficult when you're experiencing adversity. Like if your car is broken and you can't get somewhere, you might experience some emotions, and you can't get away from that reality right then, so what do? So you do have to deal with some situations like that sometimes. But in this situation where I'm experiencing just mental pain, just moving your attention back, not letting that grief dominate your thoughts, moving your attention to your breath, to your footstep, to your mouth if you're eating, whatever it is, as long as you're not doing that with your mouth too much, which is what I do sometimes. But moving your mind to a wholesome place. And then every time that grief arises, the same way you would on the meditation cushion, just move your mind back to that wholesome object. And eventually it gets weaker and weaker, and eventually it will dissipate. But definitely this doesn't mean avoiding any kind of contact or interaction with life, because it's just part of life that these things potentially will arise, but you can dictate your future. That's what the Eightfold Path is all about. Choosing from this moment on, not from the past necessarily, but from this moment on, how you will interact with the expressions of your past actions. So the skillful choice that you make in this moment really dictates everything about the future. And that's why I really love my Dharma name so much. It means manifestation of choice. And I feel like that's perfect. Absolutely. Because that's everything. Manifesting in this moment the Eightfold Path for how you will move forward how you'll interact with those inner issues that you have, not pushing them away, not striving to get something else, just allowing it to be there. That's how it passes away and how you attain peace. The other thing about it, I think that's important to note, is within this scheme of the Eightfold Path and this choice that you're making in this one moment, this right effort, I feel like, is, for me anyway, it's everything. Right effort is basically just, there are 4 components to it, but it's increasing the good stuff and decreasing the bad stuff. That's what this is. That's what this does. If you're choosing the right choices, right being subjective, of course, but if you're choosing the skillful choices that lead toward a more peaceful life, a more peaceful mind, eventually that will be the result that you get, and this is how you do it. One other component of that, though, is making sure to take care of your senses whenever you are interacting with this moment, because you have to understand that just as you can choose what your mind dwells on in this moment, you can also choose what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're maybe not feeling, what you're experiencing in the world. So, for example, if you go into a freezer, it will be cold. If you watch violent movies all the time, there will be more violence that encounters your mind, whether that causes restlessness or something like that. If you drink alcohol, your mind will be restless. These are things that you can experience, and we can take care of our senses by making skillful choices. That's where the precepts come up and further practice. But even without that, even without doing precepts and vows and things like that, it's just sort of a relatively easy to understand thing once you put it that way. Of course, encountering things that are potentially violent, like video games and stuff like that, can maybe not make you more violent, but make you restless. Makes sense. Just killing all the time and things like that. It's something that I don't think I understood when I was younger. Something like that can affect you. So anyway, being careful what you do with your mind in the moment is basically what leads to your future. Of course, there will be, just like with Sasha and these past past experiences that come up, of course, things will happen that you might not want to be there based on your own choices in the past. One quick example is this might not be as quick as I hope. There's a famous story in the Buddha Suttas about Angulimala, who was a serial killer, and the Buddha encountered him. Long story short, Angulimala, eventually becomes a disciple of the Buddha, and he obtains enlightenment, and he is doing okay, but he shed off all of that killing nature that he had. But his karma still catches up with him. Some people, he will go to a town and people apparently would throw stones at him, and all kinds of negative things befell him because of his past actions. So these things arise, but in the case of someone like Angulimala or me, who is experiencing the result of your past behavior, your past attachment, your craving, all you really need to do is interact with it skillfully and learn how to do that and move your mind back to something that is a skillful quality. And eventually that will dissipate. Maybe not totally in the effect of the world, but in its effect on you. And that's the most important part. I think that's all I've got today. Thank you for listening.